Hello, welcome back to our VBS, our virtual Bible school. This is the third day of Bible school, and of course, being Bible school, we're studying the Bible. And as I've told you, if you've been with us for the last couple of days, the Bible is divided into two main parts, the Old Testament and the New Testament. The Old Testament is this thicker part at the beginning of the Bible, and the New Testament is not quite so long. We've had a story from the Old Testament, we've had a story from the New Testament. Today, I'm used to Bible school happening at night. Today's story is from the Old Testament. And I want to tell you that the Bible is divided into two main parts, the Old Testament and the New Testament. But inside each one of those parts are a bunch of what we call books. So the Bible is a book, but it's divided into more books. Today's story comes from the book of Exodus. Do you know what Exodus means? If you've ever been in a building, you might, if you know how to read, you might have seen a sign saying exit. And that means that's the way you go out. To exit is to go out. So the book of Exodus is about leaving a place. And this is the beginning of that exit. Moses, some of you are familiar with Moses. Moses grew up in a place called Egypt. I want you to imagine that this part of the story layout is the country of Egypt. And this part over here is a different country, and it's named Midian. You don't have to remember that, that's just the name of it. Egypt is over here, and where Moses is right now is in a whole different country, long way away. Moses grew up in this part, in Egypt. And he was one of the Israelites, the people of God, who were slaves in Egypt. Now you see, the other day I talked about slaves in Egypt, and here you have them working. These slaves are making bricks. Can you see these bricks? They're making them, they're hauling them, they're working together. There would have been other slaves who would have taken these bricks and made buildings out of them. There were a lot of slaves, and they were often mistreated. Can you see this guy here? Here is a slave, and here is the slave boss. Sometimes the slave bosses would beat the slaves. Sometimes the slaves would even die. Now, this guy doesn't want to stand up. I'm going to take him over here just to hold him up. They would beat the slaves, sometimes they would die, and the king, who was a pharaoh, but he was the king, he didn't care. The only thing he cared about was the work that the slaves would do. And there were so many of them, he didn't care if they died. He didn't care if they were mistreated. Well, Moses grew up here with the Pharaoh in Egypt. He was never a slave, though. That's a different story, and maybe you can come to Sunday school sometime and we'll tell you that part of the story. These were his relatives. Some of them probably were uncles, they had aunts, probably cousins who were slaves. But Moses was never a slave. When he was a young man, though, and he knew these were his people, and he saw how they were mistreated, he did something kind of bad and he ran away. He ran away, far away, to Midian. Now many years have passed. Here's Moses as a young man. Many years have passed, and now he's an old man. He went to Midian, he got married, he had some children, and he worked for his father-in-law. And what he did for his father-in-law was to watch the sheep. And one day, he was out watching his father-in-law's sheep when he saw a bush that was burning, but it wasn't burning up. You might see that there's green still in this bush, but there are flames coming out of it. And Moses saw that and he thought, that's really strange. I'm going to have to go check that out. So he did. He went and he looked at that bush. He got closer and he heard a voice. And the voice said, Moses, Moses. Moses knew that that was the voice of God. The first thing that God told him was to take his shoes off, because this was holy ground. It was sacred ground. It was ground that belonged to God. Take your shoes off to show respect. And so Moses did. He took his shoes off. And then the voice said, Moses, I want you to go to Egypt and tell the Pharaoh to let my people go. Go and get the slaves out of slavery. Bring them out of Egypt. And Moses said, who me? Me? Who am I to go talk to the Pharaoh about that? I don't even talk very well. But God said, I will be with you. I will be with you. I will give you help. So even though Moses wasn't too sure at the beginning, he went because he knew that his people needed hope. So he did. He went back to Egypt. And eventually he did get the Pharaoh to let the people go with God's help. So then the people had hope.